Explorers have always sought out the extremes on Earth. They seek that which has never been done, whether to climb the tallest mountain or to walk where no man has ever been before. Expeditions are my way of life. In 1979, I led the very first journey to circumnavigate Earth through both poles. It was a grueling expedition which took 3 years to accomplish and 7 years to plan. I've been doing expeditions for over 30 years, starting in the British Army. That was where I first met the Land Rover. The Land Rover has been around for 50 years. From its humble beginnings, conceived to save the Rover Car Company in post-war Britain, to world leader in the field it created. These pioneers played a major role in the early days of the company. Tom Barton, designer of the original Land Rover, Spen King, father of the Range Rover, Jeff Miller, development engineer, and Roger Craythorne, demonstration manager, span 50 years' experience designing and developing Land Rovers. They remember creating the first civilian off-road vehicle. The variations, the expeditions, innovations, and new products. They've returned to the home of Land Rover in Solihull, England, to reminisce, witness the transformation of their visions, and to look into the future. The story begins with a family named Wilkes. At the end of the war, Stephen Wilkes was a youngster, spending the summers with his family on the island of Anglesey in Wales. His father Maurice and uncle Spencer Wilkes were in the car business.
My uncle Spen was the chairman of Rover for many years. He was really instrumental, obviously, in my father actually even being employed there at all. My father, I wouldn't describe my father as a businessman. Not really. He was much more of a solving technical problems, that type of thing. A man who was full of interest. There was always this sort of child there. He would be onto one thing and then it would be onto another thing. He always loved making things. He had an automatic mowing machine. It consisted of a piece of plywood about 4 foot by 3 foot. Then there was a motor vehicle back axle that would drive these wheels. Then the mower would go around on a string, and as it went round, of course, it would make the trolley move along.
But there was another side to this carefree family life. The year was 1947, and the Wilkes brothers were struggling to keep the Rover Car Company afloat. Economic conditions after the war were bleak. The automobile industry was particularly hard hit. Steel was in short supply and given only to companies with products to export. That same year, England suffered the worst winter in decades. But it set the stage for Maurice Wilkes to develop an idea for a new product that would change the course of history for the Rover Car Company.
There was a lot of snow, as I recall, and a great storm that followed after that, and floods. And the storm blew down lots of trees down the drive, so access to the house, well, you couldn't get there with a motor vehicle. And so it was important to my dad to be able to clear these trees as quickly as possible. He started using Rover cars to pull these trees and things out of the way. and found that it wasn't the right type of vehicle for that. Being into government surplus equipment, he managed to buy a surplus Bren gun carrier, which is a tracked vehicle. It's a bit like a tank, but a very small one.
Morris saw the practicality of the Bren gun carrier, but he also realized its obvious limitations. A neighbor, Colonel Nash, owned something which intrigued him even more, a military surplus Willis Jeep.
My dad had said to this Colonel Nash, he said, well, how about us doing a trade? You take my Bren gun carrier and I'll have your Willis Jeep.
He found numerous uses for the Jeep. But, more importantly, it gave him an idea which might save the company. Stephen's brother, Patrick, remembers the events of that summer.
There's a story my mother tells about when my father came down here with her one day, and my uncle's boat came in there, and he came over in a dinghy, and my father and my uncle sat down on the sand somewhere here, and they drew in the sand like this, and they were drawing a picture of the first Land Rover. They were designing it in the sand.
To translate the sketch in the sand, Wilkes went to the Rover drawing office and sought out section leader Tom Barton.
MC Wilkes had this brilliant idea and called us 5 section leaders, there was then, up into his farm in Anglesey and showed us his old Jeep. And he said, well, as a stopgap, we've got to do something.
Morris proposed to take the utilitarian concept of the Jeep, improve the design for civilian use, and build a vehicle with Rover parts. Historically, the Rover Car Company had only made automobiles. This new idea, a vehicle designed for export, would put the Rover Car Company back to work. The only real competition would be the Jeep, and its manufacturer realized the potential for a civilian model as well. It would be a bold move to go up against this already successful product. But for Rover, there was really no choice. The international market was the only option, as it was faced with export or die. Tom Barton remembers the daunting task handed to him by his boss.
We shall have to make vehicles as cheaply as we can. And you 5 go back here and I want a vehicle similar to that the farmers can use, ploughing, harrowing, all these sorts of things, and I'll give you 12 months.
So they went to work on a 4-wheel drive vehicle that had a rugged boxed chassis that was much stronger than the Jeeps, and a power takeoff that ran a variety of tools. It became a Land Rover trademark. Because steel was in short supply, they used aluminium for the body panels. It was corrosion resistant, plentiful, and cheap. The vehicle needed to be tested. What better place to push it to the limits than the family farm on Anglesey?
I remember the Jeep disappeared and this rather stubby aluminium vehicle arrived. And I remember great discussions as to what it should be called. And I think my father actually coined Land Rover.
The Land Rover debuted on April the 30th, 1948 at the Amsterdam Motor Show. The Rover Car Company immediately launched a marketing campaign, including this clever piece of cinema to promote their new product. They called it the farmer's best friend.
In the British Isles and other agricultural countries, there are still many farmers who rely on the horse as a means of pulling machinery and heavy loads. What I want, says many a farmer, is something that can do everything the horse can do, plus a lot more, and at 3 times the speed. And here it is, the Land Rover. A tough, chunky, cheeky, versatile vehicle with an unlimited capacity for hard work. You can almost see it cock a snook at the old horse in the next field and hear it say, anything you can do, I can do better. Next job, please.
Europe's first civilian off-road vehicle was a resounding success. When the first production models began rolling off the assembly line in July of '48, it was apparent that the planned 100 Land Rovers a week wouldn't even begin to fill the demand. There was no end to the uses around the farm. With an 80-inch wheelbase, a 52-horsepower four-cylinder engine, and permanent four-wheel drive, the little Land Rovers were performing feats of daring do far beyond their size and far beyond Rover's original concept as the farmer's best friend. Just what was this husky little workhorse all about? Even though 50 years have passed since this film was made, we still can't say it any better.
There's something about the purposeful, functional Land Rover that makes an irresistible appeal to the young and the young in heart. There she is, 4 cylinders, 2 litres, overhead inlet valve side exhaust to give real slugging power. She develops 52 brake horsepower, does about 23 miles to the gallon on the road, and up to 60 miles an hour. How's she different from an ordinary car? Jump in and I'll show you. To begin with, she's got 4-wheel drive. That means you can go anywhere the tires will grip. Then you've got 10 speeds, 8 forward and 2 reverse, 4 high ratios for normal use and 4 low ones for the really rough stuff.
During the late 40s and early 50s, Land Rover cemented a reputation for building the world's most versatile vehicle. Land Rover offered models for a variety of duties. Its versatility made it a natural for leisure pastimes. Even royalty and heads of state wanted to ride in a Land Rover. It quickly became a favorite of military forces around the world, seeing action for the first time in 1950 during the Korean conflict. By 1952, it had been fitted with a larger, more powerful engine. 1954 brought a 107-inch wheelbase pickup variant. And later, the familiar long wheelbase four-door station wagon appeared. Toward the end of the 50s, a vast array of body types and specialty applications were available, and the wheelbases of the short and long versions were stretched to 88 and 109 inches.
One step more was needed to make the Land Rover the truly universal vehicle, namely to produce it in both petrol and diesel versions.
In 1957, Land Rover introduced an all-new overhead valve four-cylinder diesel that was followed in 1958 by a gasoline engine with a similar design.
From now on, you can buy a Land Rover to run on the fuel of your choice.
Descendants of these robust engines are still in production today. The decade of the 50s brought prosperity back to the Rover Car Company as the 250,000th Land Rover rolled off the line in 1959. The possibilities of four-wheel drive caught on with the adventuresome. A new breed of enthusiast emerged, eager to learn about off-road. Perhaps this was the birth of the Land Rover lifestyle, the first step away from its strictly utilitarian role into recreational pursuits. Over time, the Rover Company set up test courses at the factory grounds at Solihull and began to teach.
Commonest mistake is to tackle the tricky bits too fast with too high revs. A Land Rover, like any other mount, mechanical or horseflesh, gives of its best when each obstacle is approached intelligently and not in a mad rush. For example, taking uneven muddy ground too fast.
The 1950s were known as the age of expeditions. Suddenly, people were driving through Africa, Asia, and South America. And it's estimated that the first vehicle ever seen by 1/3 of the world's population is the Land Rover.
In those days, expeditions were part of the development of the vehicle, weren't they? I mean, back in the Series 1 days, we got 80, well, by then I think there were 86-inch Land Rovers, but we had the Oxford and Cambridge expedition.
And always rivers to cross, rivers and streams without names. Waters bridged once years ago by men of the 14th Army, who were sometimes called the Forgotten Army. In Singapore, they get the welcome they deserve as the first motorists to have driven across this great overland route. These sturdy Oxford and Cambridge vehicles were examined by the Rover organization on their return, and it was found not a bit the worse for this toughest of endurance tests. 18,000 miles, London to Singapore.
These were heady times for Land Rover. Orders flooded in from all over the world. But the original design was ready for improvement.
My mum, she always used to get on to my dad. She said, these vehicles, they're made for men, by men. He said, why don't you think of the other half of the population? That's women. He said, look at these corners, they're all sharp and jagged. I ladder my tights, stockings in those days, across the sharp edge of this thing. These different considerations that she had, she'd make well known.
In April of 1958, an all-new Land Rover debuted that was called the Series 2. This meant that in retrospect, the old model became known as the Series 1. The changes were hailed by aficionados, but perhaps didn't go quite far enough for Barbara Wilkes.
Visibility has been improved on the long Land Rover. The rear window is larger and rounded quarter lights have been added. All windows are now of non-scratch glass. The doors have external handles and can be locked.
This new Land Rover brought the line into an evolutionary period. With more work capacity and greater comfort, these new Land Rovers relit the fires of a hot sales era.
Yes, the Series 2 Land Rovers are an improvement over their predecessors, and also a complete vindication of the original design, for the improvements are in fact only refinements of the original idea.
The 1960s could probably be called Land Rover's Age of Specials. The Series 2 evolved into the Series 2A, with a few mechanical improvements in 1961. By April 1966, the total number of vehicles produced reached 500,000. The vehicles reached new levels of adaptation and multi-use roles. In the mid-60s, there were 150 different variants available. Military forces all over the world ordered armoured cars, ambulances, and a lightweight air portable version.
And of course, everywhere the Army goes, the Land Rover goes too. Here she goes, weighing well over a ton with trailer. And here she comes, safe and sound. And it's just one more problem to which the Land Rover provides the answer, for it packs more power and usefulness into a few cubic feet than any other vehicle on Earth.
Around the world, the sight of Land Rovers had become very common, but in America they were still a bit of a curiosity. As far back as 1950, small numbers had been imported. But as Americans realized their recreational potential, the market grew. By 1967, special North American export versions were produced to compete with other 4x4s. Sales peaked at several thousand units, but emission regulations were tightening, and the relatively few numbers did not justify the investment. And so, with sales booming everywhere else, the American market was abandoned in 1974 for greener pastures. The experience was to be a valuable lesson later on. Even though Maurice Wilkes's design was supremely capable, it did not provide a high degree of comfort.
Going down to the beach, that was really an exercise because you had to go through a marsh on the way, and you couldn't just get through the marsh in the ordinary way. You had to charge it. It felt like quite fast when it was on rough ground like this, you know. And you sploosh it and then whoop, it would go like this, and all the mud would come flying over the front of the thing, and the windscreen wipers would be going already.
As the recreational possibilities were being discovered, Land Rover engineers realized that they had to refine the basic vehicle. They found a growing need for comfortable, but off-highway capable estate cars, or station wagons as Americans called them. It was an intriguing concept, a 4x4 recreational vehicle. It became the new focus for development. A young engineer was appointed head of Rover's new vehicle projects team. He was an innovative free thinker, fresh from a gas turbine car project. His name was Spen King.
The target was to make a vehicle with conventional seating, which Land Rover really hadn't got in those days, to make it a very good ride by car standards on the road, and ride and handling and everything to motor car standards of those days, and to make it as good or possibly better than Land Rover off-road.
As Rover saw the need for more comfortable off-road vehicles, an engineer named Graham Bannock discovered an identical trend developing in the United States.
It was simultaneous. I mean, he was doing this investigation which said that the leisure 4x4 market was in for a big growth, and God knows he was right.
Vehicles like the Ford Bronco and Chevy Blazer were headlining the growing recreational 4x4 market. Once again, it was time to convince the board.
As Spen said, one of the first things we must do is to show what they were known as new vehicle projects people what 4x4s were about. So we decided to take 15 or 20 Land Rovers down to Eastnor and some competitive vehicles, Nissan, Toyota, Bronco, International Scout. We did a 2-day safari and convinced them of the off-road abilities of Land Rover, and in some cases the lack of off-road ability of some of the competition.
The team was convinced, and King led the development. They built several prototypes with decoy names, such as Velar and Road Rover, and finally settled on the one that became the world-renowned Range Rover. The next step was to convince the board of directors to build it.
One of the first demonstration dives was to have this dramatic entry of the red number 6 prototype down a grassy bank where we got all of the directors.
Roger Craythorne realized it would take a clever presentation to impress the board, using one of the most basic rules of salesmanship.
It's like most things. If you've got to sell a new design, you need to show people and not just tell them. So, you know, pictures tell a lot of stories about just how well things work. We basically took the body off a Range Rover, put a roll cage on for safety, loaded it to the correct unladen weight.
The unique rolling chassis clearly showed the innovative long travel coil spring suspension and live axle location. The setup provided a more comfortable ride and even better off-road capability. The newly acquired V8 engine was powerful and lightweight. Permanent four-wheel drive gave it predictable handling. Disc brakes were fitted for the first time on a vehicle of this type, as was a load leveling device between the rear axle and the chassis. But Spen had one more goal:
to make it more smooth and acceptable looking in appearance, and I think we succeeded.
The new Range Rover was launched in June 1970, and like the little Land Rover in 1948, it became the new European automotive rage. It claimed numerous design awards and was even hailed at the Louvre in Paris as automotive art. Unlike the Range Rovers of today, these first examples were not particularly luxurious. but they were versatile.
And go anywhere means just that. Go shopping, go visiting, go to work, go to school. Range Rovers are so many cars in one. If you're open-air types, this is the car to get you there. Hiking or skiing or just getting away from the rat race, the Range Rover does it for you, together with all the gear every family carts around. Helping a much older sister through a situation that no ordinary saloon car would even attempt on its own is just a courtesy for the Range Rover. The Range Rover is a real performance car and a real car for the sporting family. You can tow a big yacht and launch it too if you like. Then, free of the trailer, it's off on the open road with all the punch and go of a fast touring saloon. With 8 forward gears, the Range Rover will go up a mountain. It does. A car for the town and a car for the country. A car for all reasons. The Range Rover.
For Range Rover to truly be a member of the Land Rover family, it was important for it to prove itself.
One of the first things you thought of was take it on an expedition. This was part of the philosophy of development. We built 2 Range Rovers, the idea being they were going to be driven from Anchorage in Alaska right down the North American continent, across Central America, down South America to Tierra del Fuego.
The Darien Gap in Panama, with its beastly climate, dense, hilly rainforest, ravines and swamps, stood as a barricade between North and South America. The British Army undertook a road-building exercise through this hostile territory, and it cemented Range Rover's reputation for being robust and rugged. The filmmakers viewed it as another milestone for the empire.
Our Choco friends watched us leave. From now, they would probably reckon their calendar from the year the motorcars came.
These smooth paved roads are misleading, and they will peter out and turn into a rough track. So rough in places that it would shake an ordinary car to pieces.
Range Rovers were also put to the test in other parts of the world. In 1970, Land Rover engineers and Ken Slavin drove across the Sahara Desert. The 1,000-mile journey through Central Africa was a good proving ground, with temperature extremes and variety of terrain. Meanwhile, the humble Land Rover 88 and 109 had remained basically unchanged since the Series 2 took a bow in 1958. By 1971, the changes were enough for a new model to be dubbed the Series 3.
Under a policy of continuous improvement, there is not a single part in this, the first Land Rover built in 1948, that is common to the present model. Everything has been modified and improved in the light of experience, yet nothing has really changed. The Land Rover is still the same chunky, tough, versatile and adaptable workhorse.
Once again, the Series 3 exhibited design changes typifying evolution and not revolution. On the outside, hinges were flattened, the air intake was moved, and the old wire mesh grille was replaced with a plastic one. Inside, a new dashboard housed a Land Rover First. Instruments positioned in front of the driver, making it possible to operate all switches whilst wearing a seatbelt. But perhaps the biggest improvement was a new synchromesh gearbox, making operation quieter and eliminating the need to double clutch between first and second. The Series 3 was built for purpose and quickly took up global duty. The company celebrated the 1 millionth Land Rover in June 1976. With all this success, it was apparent that this was no ordinary car company. Something special was happening.
We was all enthusiastic, mad, keen on the Land Rover.
It was one happy family.
You didn't seem that you had to go on a team building exercise then, because everybody works as a team and you knew everybody.
A high proportion of us on development and in the experimental shop ran our own Land Rovers, and we went trialling with the clubs in our own Land Rovers.
Yet another Land Rover tradition continued. Club rallies built tremendous enthusiasm and loyalty for the marque. Indeed, it's possible to detect the emergence of a new leisure pastime. In the early 80s, Land Rover found a new opportunity to showcase the now legendary capabilities of its vehicles. It was called the Camel Trophy. This was pure four-wheel drive adventure, the Olympics of off-roading. Each year, amateur teams headed out to tackle challenging terrain across the planet's most remote regions. This was nothing new for Land Rover and was viewed as the perfect way to show the tough side of Range Rover. 4 teams slogged 1,000 miles through Sumatra in 1981. In 1982, 8 two-man teams from 4 nations crossed New Guinea. Even though this was an international competition, teamwork was vital to complete the crossing. And the cooperation of 700 local tribes didn't hurt either. The phenomenal success of the Range Rovers prompted engineers to incorporate its innovative design hallmarks into the Land Rover, including permanent four-wheel drive and coil spring suspension. 2 new models emerged, named after their wheelbase lengths. The 110 immediately headed out to Brazil. The 90 tackled Borneo. A year later, Australia. Not to be outdone, Range Rover, with a new turbo diesel engine, traversed Madagascar in 1987. Included in the convoy was an official team from the United States. Tom Collins and Don Floyd spent 3 weeks making the first crossing of the island. It was punishment and hardship, with rewards in the once-in-a-lifetime category. "40 years after the first Land Rover rolled off the production line, it was still being used for its original purpose. As a rugged utilitarian vehicle, great for expeditions or on the farm, and country lifestyle pursuits. Market research said this television commercial portrayed the essence of its image.
Next time you're late for work, it's worth remembering that nothing gets in the way of a Land Rover. The best 4x4, by far.
The 1980s saw many developments for Range Rover. A 4-door version, fuel injection, automatic transmission, and diesel engines became available. Perhaps most noteworthy, though, was the creation of a super luxury In Vogue special edition. Land Rover wanted to test the waters for a shift to an upmarket model because it had plans to tackle the world's biggest car market, North America. And here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Early research said that the idea of an expensive sport utility was a bad one. Americans wouldn't pay that much money. Or would they? Business in America commenced in 1987, selling a very exclusive high-specification Range Rover, with options never before seen on this type of vehicle. Leather seats, wood trim, premium stereo system, sunroof, and power seats, door locks and mirrors. Despite the predictions, this Range Rover was an immediate success. It sold out. The press dubbed it the gold standard of sport utilities. At that time, the sport utility market was still in its infancy, with only 10 marques available in the States. The Range Rover didn't fit the description of these more utilitarian types. It created a brand new segment in the still infant four-wheel drive market, the luxury sport utility vehicle. The North American launch was officially celebrated in 1989 with the Great Divide Expedition. 8 Range Rovers made the first off-pavement north-south crossing of the Continental Divide in Colorado by motor vehicle. The caravan covered over 1,000 miles of terrain, promoting the new Tread Lightly program, developed by the US Forest Service. At the same time, the Range Rover went headlong into the high-tech era with a bevy of electronic improvements, pioneering many four-wheel drive innovations, such as 4-channel anti-lock brakes. It became the first sport utility with a viscous-coupled center differential. A driver no longer had to set up the vehicle for tough off-roading. When the surface became slippery, the center differential locked automatically. In the early 80s, Land Rover realized it needed a new vehicle, one that combined the ruggedness of the 90 and the 110 with much of the comfort of the Range Rover. The Japanese had already found a strong demand for this mainstream sport utility. If Land Rover were to enter this market, the vehicle could not sacrifice any off-road capability. With so many years of experience, it shouldn't be difficult to produce a winner. Discovery was launched in 1989 at the Frankfurt Motor Show. It was the first entirely new Land Rover in almost 20 years. The design picked up cues from Land Rover vehicles. The roof was raised and given windows. The spare wheel was mounted on the rear. Many of the chassis components came from Range Rover. Like other Land Rover products, it created a sensation, winning the British Design Council Award. Discovery was an authentic Land Rover and quickly joined the expeditionary ranks. In the late 1960s, my guide, who was a Bedou from the Empty Quarter, which is the greatest sand desert in the world, told me of a lost city where all the frankincense had been stored. It had been lost 4,000 years ago, and I decided to start looking for it. We drove into the middle of the Empty Quarter. 700-foot-high sand dunes, areas of very soft bog sand. Eventually, in the early 1990s, we found it in a place called Shissa. By 1990, 1 million were applying annually for the Camel Trophy adventure. Discovery was tapped for the crossing of Siberia. It quickly proved it was a genuine Land Rover. American participation was now solidly locked in. US team trials, directed by Tom Collins, narrowed the field to 4. Reasons for trying out varied. and proved you didn't have to be young to be fit.
Satisfaction, that's all I'm after. It's also an opportunity to demonstrate to my family, my kids, mainly my kids, that they can do whatever they want. When I got my application, they asked the question if you could run a 6-minute mile. I put it down and started running.
In 1992, Dan Ammon and teammate Jim West from Phoenix, Arizona, joined the adventure in South America, living in their Discovery for 3 weeks. Their efforts to help other teams earned them the coveted Team Spirit Award. A year later, Discoveries led the adventure in Sabah, Malaysia. Even though it took a united effort to cross the lost world, teams were scored for the many skills required to complete the journey. This was another record year for the American team. Tim Hensley of Portland, Oregon, and Michael Hussey of Middlebury, Vermont, had never met before the US trials. By the end of the event, they had managed to beat the jungle and the rest of the nations to win the Camel Trophy. With Discovery, Land Rover now had a 3-model lineup. It was decided to put a name on the over 40-year-old descendant of the original. It was dubbed Defender, thereby establishing Land Rover as the manufacturer of a range of 4-wheel drive vehicles. Under its new name, the utility workhorse continued to serve as public servant and peacekeeper. On the leisure front, four-wheeling had exploded. Range Rover became the vehicle of choice by the country set. The company capitalized on the opportunity and began to promote the Land Rover lifestyle. The Land Rover driving experience was established at the factory in Solihull and at Eastnor Castle.
Really, it's a case as slow as possible, as fast as necessary. And it seems to be a direct contradiction, but that's the way we want to be. And we're getting a nice, smooth ride now. It's just...
You've got to remember that, as slow as possible, as fast as necessary.
The Land Rover Driving Academy in Aspen, Colorado, was billed as the world's most exclusive driving school. It provided an intensive course on advanced four-wheeling. The Invitations program offered Land Rover owners worldwide driving adventures at select points on the globe, like the incredible rocks in the Moab, Utah region. By the early 90s, the classic Range Rover needed a major enhancement to stay in front of a wave of competitors from America and Japan. The long wheelbase version once again marked technological firsts for four-wheel drive. Height adjustable air suspension and electronic traction control. After an unprecedented 25-year run, this Spen King design had become the icon of the luxury four-wheel drive segment. One of the most successful vehicles in automotive history was a source of tremendous pride. The success was a surprise to its creator.
I don't think any of us anticipated how successful
but we knew we were clever.
Be. Yeah, we knew. No, don't be more modest. We knew we'd done something good, frankly.
Yeah, we did.
But we didn't know.
We knew it was special.
We didn't know it was going to cut as much ice as it has done over the years.
1994 heralded the introduction of an all-new Range Rover, built in a new state-of-the-art assembly plant. It was the crowning glory for Land Rover, with its ultra-modern, high-tech engineering. The technical achievements were impressive. It had more computing power than the Apollo 11 spacecraft, and an innovative dual-range gear shift. The new Range Rover leapt miles ahead of the competition, maintaining its position as sport utility king. It fits seamlessly into its role as the leader of the four-wheel drive lifestyle. For decades, the marque has been a favorite with celebrities and public figures worldwide. Sport utilities have become the hottest automotive segment, and manufacturers rushed to cash in on their popularity. But surveys showed the car buying experience was extremely distasteful. Alternatives surfaced, with superstores selling more than one brand, offering a no-haggle approach. Land Rover chose another tack. It capitalized on the lifestyle and adventure appeal of the vehicles and created something called centers. They looked more like hunting lodges than showrooms. Sales guides dressed as explorers and used demonstration courses to sell the off-road capabilities.
You're close now, Bob. You're real close.
They also created excitement.
Yes! He's on there!
All right, 32 seconds.
Good job.
Nice touch.
Good job.
32 seconds.
Since the North American market had proven so successful for the Range Rover, 1994 brought the inevitable, Discovery. And like its predecessor, it became an immediate hot number. Four Wheeler magazine named it 1995 Four-Wheeler of the Year. It was immediately tapped for an expedition to the world of the ancient Maya in Central America. La Ruta Maya, an expedition of discovery, transported replicas of Maya artifacts to an archaeological site in the rainforest of Belize. This expedition represented the absolute essence of the Land Rover marque values. It was true adventure, providing the freedom to explore the mystery of the Maya. A very authentic endeavor, in authentic vehicles displaying supremacy in negotiating the route. It underscored the individualism of the participants and their guts to tackle this challenge. Archaeology and ecology were the themes again in 1997 for the Mongolia expedition. Two discoveries made the first continuous north-south border-to-border crossing of Mongolia in support of a long-term ecological research program. A people who have seen little change over the centuries inhabit the pristine environment. They are the last horse-based nomadic culture in the world. The Gobi Desert yields rich beds of dinosaur fossils, left 70 million years ago. Paleontologists come to the Flaming Cliffs to try to find the answer to their mysterious extinction. There are few roads in Mongolia, and the travelers relied heavily on their vehicles and several forms of navigation to complete the journey. As Land Rover turned 50, the next generation was born, an all-new, lightweight model. The first Land Rover without a separate chassis frame, and the first with a transversely mounted front engine. It is called Freelander. And even though it was originally developed for Europe, Land Rover reveals it has plans for eventual sales worldwide. Freelander fit neatly into a new 4x4 segment, the Mini SUV. It is engineered with more than 16 patented features, including hill descent control. It was not designed to replace or even compete with Discovery or Defender, remaining true to the Land Rover's mission to build the best 4x4 vehicles within each segment of the market. "12 months on the heels of Freelander, the new generation of discovery appeared, the Series 2. It has been 10 years since its introduction, and by 1999, sport utilities are extremely popular, not only as four-wheel drives, but for daily duties, and they are expected to handle predictably as passenger cars. Advances in automotive technology have made it possible to improve ride and handling. Even though designers choose to evolve the appearance of Discovery Series 2, under the skin there is a revolution in performance. By the end of the 90s, it is clear that the decade has been Land Rover's age of technology. Using onboard computers and advanced hydraulics, body lean in cornering is greatly reduced using a patented system called ACE. This is short for Active Cornering Enhancement. Land Rover engineers have used components of the anti-lock braking system to create even more capability. Off-road driving techniques must therefore also be changed. When a wheel spins, a driver should stay on the throttle instead of letting up, allowing the four-wheel electronic traction control to send power to the wheels with the most grip. Land Rovers have become more capable than ever. Hill descent control takes it another step. Using ABS, speed is limited, providing better control downhill. Is it possible this Land Rover does a better job than even the driver? Discovery Series 2 undergoes extensive testing, and to prove it is a true Land Rover, makes what is claimed to be the world's longest test drive, a trip around the world. 2 Series 2s are driven from Solihull in England, across Europe, Asia, Australia, the United States, Central America, and from the coast of Spain up to Paris. It is timed to end at the Paris Motor Show, where it is introduced to the world, and sales take off. In Colorado, Land Rover owners are given a preview of this new generation at the Land Rover Lodge. Many think they put their own Land Rovers to good work and find the extreme conditions a real eye-opener. Off-roading opportunities in North America leave Europeans envious of the extensive and diverse terrain. Series 2 is a fitting cap on 50 years. What about the future? For years, Land Rover had little real competition, but times change, and there are now 19 manufacturers selling over 40 sports utility models in the US alone. The 4 pioneers were given a very special behind-the-scenes tour of GDEC, the Rover Group Design Center, by Jeff Upex, design chief, and some of his top people.
Well, actually, this isn't the specific.
We aim to shock, you know.
Well,
you
it's a very distinct defender filter at the
I don't know if it's right at all, but I'd be worried about it.
Where are we trying to get to with the Land Rover as a piece of design?
You've certainly made it look like a Land Rover product.
Yeah. Where does Land Rover go in the future, and what aesthetic quality represents what Land Rover's about? And how is it separated from everybody else who's gone into the markets that we're in? The market itself has got a lot more sophisticated, but I think actually the solution that you come up with still has to have the same simple elegance that Defender had in 1948.
The energy and innovative thinking hasn't changed much in 50 years. But the technology has. This is where the future of Land Rover lies.
When I see
Of course, 50 years is not the end of the story. Land Rover will continue to make great vehicles, and explorers will always find something new to do. In a short while, I will begin my next expedition. We will, of course, be using Land Rovers.